Welcome, folks, to the Day of Resistance rally. We are here today to send a very clear message to both politicians and the media that we support the U.S. Constitution and more specifically the Second Amendment. I want to start out by talking about this flag right here. Today in history in Iwo Jima, 5 Marines and 1 Navy U.S. Corpsman raised that flag at Iwo Jima, and 3 of them did not make it through that battle. How many people here, raise your hand if you've served in the United States military? Keep your hands up. Applause, please. Every one of you that has your hands up took an oath to defend the Constitution from enemies, foreign and domestic. You took that oath, and even though you're not wearing a uniform anymore, I believe that oath still stands. I am here today as a Christian constitutionalist to talk to you about the Constitution, freedom and liberty, the Second Amendment, and gun control. I'd like to get a raise of hands of how many people agree with this statement, that the United States of America is the most blessed nation that has ever existed on the face of the earth. Raise your hand if you agree with that. Amen. There's some reasons for that. One is focus on God, a unique document called the U.S. Constitution, a focus on freedom and liberty, and a focus on small government at the local level. Let's talk about that for a second. Let's dive into the Constitution here for a moment. Article 1, Section 8 of the U.S. Constitution states it gives 18 powers to the federal government. The 10th Amendment to the Constitution says any powers not given specifically to the federal government, those powers automatically go to the state or to the people. And I want to put emphasis on the people here. Okay, the Founding Fathers intended for most power to be at the state and local level so that you could interact with your representatives and have an impact on what they think and how they vote. I think you would all agree that's all been flipped upside down, and the federal government has too much control right now. What happened about 80 to 100 years ago is, starting with Roosevelt and Wilson, they started using the Commerce Clause and the General Welfare Clause, and using those clauses broadly interpreted to grab power that the federal government was never intended to have. And that started a spiral decay over the last 80 years of degrading our rights. In my opinion, the executive and legislative branches are generally out of control, and unfortunately the judicial branch and the media is not keeping the checks and balances that were intended to keep the branches in check. Folks, if you go on the street and ask miscellaneous citizens what kind of government we have, I am convinced that 9 out of 10 of them will tell you that we have a democracy here. This is not supposed to be a democracy. This is supposed to be a constitutional republic. And unfortunately, most Americans aren't even aware of that. Let's talk about that for a second. First of all, the word democracy is not mentioned in the Declaration of Independence or the U.S. Constitution. And neither is separation of church and state either. Just want to throw that out there. The Founding Fathers, they feared a democracy as much as they feared a monarchy. They said this: the only thing that can result in your rights being taken away is your own government doing one of 2 things. One is being too weak to protect yourself or protect us from external threats. The second risk is your government becoming too powerful and taking over every aspect of our lives. I wonder which way we've gone in that. I think it's probably the latter. The Founding Fathers intended for the people of America to be sovereign. Not the government to be sovereign, but for you to be sovereign. And we're getting away from that. A constitutional republic has some similarities with a democracy, in the respect that it uses a democratic process to elect representatives and pass new laws. However, the difference is a constitutional republic has the Constitution that limits the power of government. It also spells out how government is structured, creates checks and balances, checks on its power, and establishes a balance of power between the different branches. The Founding Fathers, folks, intended for us not to get to either extreme. On one side of the spectrum, you have 0% government control. That is called anarchy. On the other side of the spectrum, you have 100% government control, which is tyranny, monarchy, oligarchy, communism, fascism, Marxism, and socialism to some degree. And those were all examples of 100% government control. The Founding Fathers intended us to be in the middle, and unfortunately we're making a steady march towards this side of the spectrum. So let's talk about the Second Amendment. I want to read the Second Amendment to you in a different way than you've probably heard it before. And it's breaking the Second Amendment into two clauses. The first clause is what we call the Justification Clause. And it says this: a well-regulated militia, being necessary to the security of a free state, leads to the Rights Clause, which is the second part of the Second Amendment. It says this: the right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed. Folks, the Second Amendment is the only amendment to the U.S. Constitution that has the word "shall not be infringed" in it. Let me give you a historical perspective of the Second Amendment. After the Constitution was written, James Madison was given the responsibility of taking over 140 recommendations from the states for amendments to the Constitution. It was his job to take those 140 plus amendments and condense them into the 10 Bill of Rights. There's a couple things to note here. Number one is your right to keep and bear arms became the Second Amendment right out of all those amendments. That's significant to recognize. Okay? Number two is the Second Amendment, as it's written now, is the fourth version of what they had discussed. The third version of the Second Amendment said this: the right of the people to keep and bear arms for the common defense shall not be infringed. But the Continental Congress voted to remove "for the common defense" because the argument was it's an individual right, and that's why it was removed. So I think it's important that we understand how the Second Amendment became the words that they are today and why they have such powerful language. The Kentucky Constitution used to say this: the right of the citizens to bear arms in defense of themselves and the state shall not be questioned. That's very powerful language too. It doesn't say that anymore. It says something to the effect of the rights of the citizens to bear arms in defense of themselves and the state shall be subject to restrictions by the General Assembly for restrictions of carrying concealed. I mean, we've gone in a completely wrong direction from the original Second Amendment equivalent in the Kentucky State Constitution. Folks, the Constitution is not there as a document to limit you. The intent was to limit the federal government. That is what the Constitution is there for. I contend that if you take away the Second Amendment, your government can take away any right that you have from you if you do not have your right to bear arms. I read something recently that a scholar went to public school books and tried to find quotes from the Founding Fathers specifically about the Second Amendment, and in public school books he could not find any actual quotes. The only places he can find them was in charter school books, private schools, and home schools. Now, I'm not saying they don't exist at all, but I think it's important that we actually go back to some of the original language, and these are all quotes from the Founding Fathers. Thomas Jefferson said this: "No free man shall be debarred the use of arms." He also said, "The strongest reason for people to retain the right to keep and bear arms is, as a last resort, to protect themselves against tyranny and government." That's your Founding Fathers, folks. He also said, "The Constitution asserts that all power is inherent in the people, and it is their right and their duty to be armed at all times." Now, I don't know about you, but looking around the crowd here, and seeing the people that we are in the presence of, I feel safer here than I do in anywhere else in northern Kentucky right now. So, Sam Adams said this. He said that the said Constitution shall never be construed to authorize Congress to prevent the people, you see the emphasis on the people in these writings, to prevent the people of the United States who are peaceful citizens from keeping and owning their own arms. Patrick Henry said, "Are we at last brought to such a humiliating and debasing degradation that we cannot be trusted with arms for our own defense? George Washington, okay, his birthday was yesterday. Great man. Do you realize George Washington denied any pay as a general or as a president? And he only took money to pay for his own expenses. True patriot. Here's a couple quotes he said. A free people ought not only to be armed and disciplined, but they should have sufficient arms and ammunition to maintain a status of independence from any who might attempt to abuse them, which would include their own government. Wow. Okay? George Washington also said, firearms stand next in importance to the Constitution itself. The rifle and the pistol are equally indispensable. The very atmosphere of firearms everywhere restrains evil interference. They deserve a place of honor with all that is good. That's a great quote from George Washington. The last quote, which isn't directly related to the Second Amendment, but I'm throwing it in here because I found it last night. It was Ronald Reagan, and he said, freedom is one of the deepest and noblest aspirations in the human spirit. Okay? I want to contend to you, and I'm probably not going to take much effort to convince you, that the Second Amendment is not about duck hunting and it's not about rifle shooting. It is about protection of yourself, including potentially against your own government. The Declaration of Independence says, we are endowed by our Creator with certain unalienable rights. The right to protect yourself is an unalienable right. And if you look it up in the dictionary, unalienable says, unable to be taken away. That's what it means in the dictionary. The Founding Fathers did not establish your rights, folks. They recognized them as unalienable rights given to you by God and recognized by man. So my point here is that your right to protect yourself is not only a constitutional right, but just as important, if not more important, your right to protect yourself is a God-given right. And I think that should be acknowledged. Okay, we're going to talk for a moment. That's a little bit of a historical context. Now we're going to talk a little bit about politicians. Okay? The good, bad, and the ugly. Okay? If you ever have a politician stand in front of you and tell you, I support your Second Amendment rights, every warning flag you have should be flying. Okay? What you want a politician to stand in front of you and say is, I support your individual right to keep and bear arms. That's what you want to hear. Okay? Unfortunately, in our political system, I've learned that not all politicians, and not all the time, but oftentimes, money, power, and control is the motivator for why people do things. So look at that, look for that as a motivator in some of the why politicians do things. When it comes to control, I'm convinced beyond a reasonable doubt that gun control is not about guns. It's about control. Okay? I found a statement the other day that kind of resonated with me. I don't know if it resonated with you. It says, gun control is like trying to reduce drunk driving by making it more difficult for sober people to own cars. It's exactly the same thing. Unfortunately, what our politicians are doing right now is when something happens in our society where somebody does anything illegal, immoral, or unethical, the politicians react to that by saying we need to pass a law to stop that from happening again. But here's the problem. The 2% that they spend all their time with, the 2% of our population, are always going to be criminals, and they're always going to do the wrong thing. We should not be limited in our freedom because of the 2%, so it needs to stop.